Ontario's environmental watchdog last week issued her annual report, and it did not mince words, calling out successive provincial governments for how they have dealt with, or rather not dealt with, toxic pollution that's contaminated Indigenous communities for decades. Diane Saxe is the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, and she joins us now for more. Welcome back.
Thank you very much.
Nice to have you in that chair. I thought what we'd do off the top here is just read an excerpt from that report that you've got there. And she shows it to the camera. Promote, promote, promote. And here we go, off to the races. Sheldon, bring this up if you would. Indigenous people and communities are disproportionately affected by pollution. Governments and industries have long turned a blind eye to contamination that adversely affects the health, ecology, and economies of Indigenous communities like Amjiwinang, Grassy Narrows, and Wabaseemoong. Serious health and environmental problems, including lack of access to safe drinking water that would not be tolerated in other communities, have long been deemed unworthy of priority, effort, or expense. After decades of inaction, the Ontario government is finally taking some steps to acknowledge and address these historical wrongs, but more is needed. Environmental justice must be part of the Ontario government's pursuit of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Okay, a lot to unpack there, so let's start to do that. Why, in your view, do you think the Ontario government is only now starting to, as you put it, take some steps to acknowledge and address these historical wrongs?
Well, my job is really to answer the question what. Why is always harder. But there are some factors that are obvious. One is the jurisdictional difference between the federal and provincial governments. And so historically, there was not much coordination between them. First Nation reserves were federal. For example, in Sarnia, the refineries are provincial, and there just wasn't a lot of communication between them. It was also very difficult for the First Nations to speak up effectively for themselves, partly due to the legacy of residential schools, partly due to the pollution itself. If you think of Grassy Narrows, where the population is seriously affected by a neurological poison, the mercury itself. And the communities have tended to be small and remote and not well off. And so they've had a whole series of obstacles to getting public attention for what they needed. They've got it now.
They have it now, thanks to you. Yes, indeed. We are going to bring up a map now to show people where a couple of these places are, because as you point out, they are remote and a lot of people don't live nearby. Grassy Narrows and Wabaseemoong. What's going on in these communities regarding water contamination?
This is really an extraordinarily terrible story. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Reed paper dumped between 9 and 11 tons of mercury, always known to be a very potent neurotoxin, into the river. And a deal was made in 1979, allowing them to walk away at a very modest cost and avoid any responsibility for cleanup or for the poisoning of the community or of the commercial fishery. So the people of Grassy Narrows and Wabaseemoong, they lost their livelihood because the fishery was closed, and they were poisoned by the mercury. And in fact, the level of mercury poisoning in that community now is much higher than it was 30 years ago.
This is going to sound ridiculous, but I do remember in science class 45 years ago pouring mercury into my hands and holding it and being fascinated by how it moved around and didn't break up like normal.
Too.
Okay, so we all did this back in the day. Did we simply have no understanding back then of how hazardous this material actually was?
Well, we didn't, but it was always clear that mercury was a human poison. And there was just no way it should have been allowed into the river.
And why was it?
I can't answer that.
Who's not minding the
Well, it was the provincial government of the day in the 60s and early 70s. There was an Ontario Water Resources Commission at that time. They allowed it, and then in 1979, the government allowed Reed paper to walk away at a very modest cost, and the province took on all the liability for the taxpayers.
Why did they do that?
I can't answer why questions.
Decisions made back in the day. Can you tell us more about the health outcomes for the people now who have been living and dealing with all of this for so many decades?
Well, as I say, mercury is a neurological toxin. It has significant effects on movement. It can affect breathing. It can cause death. It can have cognitive effects. It can have impulse control effects. It's a potent neurotoxin. Children are particularly susceptible to it.
Do you have a sense as to how many other Indigenous communities around the province there are that are dealing with this same thing?
There aren't any others that have levels of mercury that are as high, but there are not many others who have it. One of the main sources of mercury outside this particular terrible situation was deposition from coal-fired power plants. And as you know, we had 8 coal-fired power plants in Ontario, and there are hundreds in the US, which just rained mercury down all across northern Ontario. And so that's still a problem in many communities, including around Attawabscat.
Now, we've shut all our coal-fired generating stations down.
We did, thank goodness.
So theoretically, that ought to be less of a problem going forward in the province of Ontario.
There won't be any new mercury coming from our coal plants, but there's still mercury coming from the US, and in fact, there's some evidence that it may come all the way from China.
Okay, in which case, maybe this is a good time to ask this question. Air pollution obviously doesn't respect geographic boundaries or jurisdictional boundaries of provinces, countries, etc. So why is this the purview of the provincial government to fix as opposed to the federal government?
Well, that's been, of course, the argument all these decades. But what we found when we looked at circumstances in dozens of First Nations communities around Ontario, and frequently what we find is that it's a divided responsibility. So you have a picture here of Sarnia. The First Nations community is ringed by 57 industrial facilities, all of which are regulated by the province. Same thing in Grassy Narrows. The reserve was under federal jurisdiction, but the mill was and remains under provincial jurisdiction. So very often the province controls what comes into the community, and then the federal government has jurisdiction on whether or not to do anything about it once it's there.
So in your view, this is unambiguously a province of Ontario responsibility to solve?
There are parts of it that are unambiguously provincial, and in the cases that I've just mentioned where the pollution is coming from industrial facilities regulated by the province is front and center.
Okay, let's go to what they lovingly call Chemical Valley down near Sarnia. What is the source of the pollution that they're dealing with there?
Look at the stacks.
There we go. So it's all that. And what's coming out of those stacks?
Oh, a whole cocktail of things. We know that the mean level of benzene in Chemical Valley is one of the highest in Ontario. We know they have very high levels of sulfur dioxide. We know they have metals. We know they have fine particulates. Sulfur dioxide is a particular concern because the province hasn't updated the sulfur dioxide standard since 1974.
I thought they just did.
Well, finally, after the release of our report, last Friday, they released the proposal to bring that standard up to date.
And you are satisfied with the new regulations they brought forward?
Well, it's not everything we've asked for, but it's a good step.
Good step to try to get the levels of SO2 down.
That's right.
Okay. How about this? What are the health impacts of the stuff that's coming out of those stacks in Chemical Valley?
Oh, huge range. As I say, benzene is a carcinogen. It's a Class A carcinogen, so is
cancer.
Absolutely. We know that sulfur dioxide is a serious respiratory hazard. There are documented high levels of cancer, respiratory disease in the First Nations community. They're also famous around the world for a skewed sex ratio. So in 2005 was the first time that a community was documented to have twice as many girls as boys being born. And I was just down there, and a lovely kindergarten class sang me "O Canada" in Ojibwe, and there were 9 girls and 4 boys.
What accounts for that?
Something about the cocktail of pollutants. A health study's never been done. Again, in the last week, the province has agreed that they are going to work with the federal government and finally get a health study done for the first time.
Now again, presuming that there's no respect for jurisdictional boundaries, if it's air pollution, one has to infer that it's not just the First Nations that are being affected by this, the broader population is as well. Isn't that true?
Oh, very likely, but the First Nations is uniquely hemmed in by this very large number of heavy industrial facilities that are very close to them. But absolutely, air quality is a problem throughout Sarnia.
In which case, if it's a problem across the board, did you hear a lot of complaints from more than just the First Nations community?
I did not, but also, you know, you get a sense of the proximity. Imagine dropping your child off at kindergarten, and the flagpole in front of the kindergarten, they have to have 2 things that you don't see anywhere else in the province. A siren for when the air is unsafe to breathe, and a windsock so you know what direction to run.
They have that there?
At the kindergarten.
Where's this?
Amjanong in Sarnia.
That's quite telling. Did you go and see it?
Yes.
That's a bit odd, isn't it?
And inside the kindergarten, there's basically a wall showing the serious illnesses of many of the children.
And the list is made up of?
respiratory diseases.
It's all there.
Yep.
Do you feel you have the ear of the Ontario government now to do something about this?
Yes.
What gives you that impression?
Well, first of all, as I say, the sulfur dioxide regulation proposal was finally released last Friday after being locked up in the ministry for a long period of time. I've met with the minister, I've met with the deputy minister, I've met with a number of the staff in the Ministry of Environment and other ministries, and I have their assurances that my recommendations are being taken very seriously. And I also can see the result of our other work being reflected across the province. So for example, I don't know if you noticed that every municipality in Ontario now has the power to adopt a bylaw dealing with climate change. That's brand new.
Do you know how many have?
So far, none. But now that they have the power, it's for them to use their creativity and try to figure out what they're going to do to face this problem, which is the greatest that we all face.
I don't want to impugn anybody's motives here, and I don't want to diminish the responses that you've received from the current government of Ontario. But my hunch is your predecessors have all had similar meetings with previous ministers of the environment who have also given assurances that this is a top priority for us and we'll get this fixed, don't you worry, Commissioner. And yet here we are.
I take much more comfort from results than I do from promises. I think when I met you first, I told you that there were 1,800 examples on the environmental registry of ministries not complying with the Environmental Bill of Rights. That's fixed.
What do you mean fixed?
Well, I brought them up to date.
So the 1,800 have disappeared?
Pretty much.
Okay.
One of the problems that we raised with the government was that the environmental registry itself was, software is obsolete, very, very difficult to use, all kinds of problems. That's being fixed. The new software will be rolled out, should be available to the public in January. The quality of environmental notices is improving. The statements of environmental values are being updated. As I say, we have the climate change now listed in the Planning Act. It's now something that municipalities can adopt bylaws on. I can keep going. We see the results of our work.
Huh. Okay, in our remaining moments here then, I want to get a better understanding of how you see your mission, given the kind of progress that you've just described. I'm going to say two statements. I want you to tell me which one's closer to the way you see it, okay? My job is to hound the government into cleaning up its act, or my job is simply to inform the public of how the government is doing?
Oh, number two by far. I don't see myself as a hounder. My tools are a flashlight, a can opener, and a megaphone. And what I find is that when I can do that with absolute accuracy but with respect, I get much better results. And a lot of the work that I do is invisible.
And you don't mind it that way?
I was offered the choice between impact or headlines. I'd much rather have impact.
I know other commissioners who've gone for headlines, you know.
It's a popular choice.
We don't have to name names here, but you and I both know who they are. We have a Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in this country that I think every poll that I've ever seen shows people really appreciate, prize, respect. It's one of our finer institutions. And we have an Environmental Bill of Rights in this province of Ontario that I'm willing to go out on a limb and say 95% of the people don't know we have, and even the 5% who know we have it have probably never used it, or rarely used it. I wonder whether it's a hope of yours that our Environmental Bill of Rights someday will be as prized as our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Well, it's a great aspiration. We're working hard to make sure that people do learn how to use it. We know that the registry itself, poor as the software is used 1,000 times a day. We see more and more interest now of people understanding the bill. We see an upsurge in requests for investigation.
So maybe I'm wrong about that 95%.
It's getting better.
Okay. So maybe I'm not wrong, but it's getting better. In our remaining moments, I want to ask you about this. And again, I don't want to take anything away from your report, but when I talk to people about the environment, there is a lot of compassion saturation that comes back at me. You're smiling because you know what I'm talking about. People want to do well by the environment, but not necessarily if it's going to double their taxes, and not necessarily if it's going to dramatically change their lifestyle. I hear people say this to me all the time. There's only so many things they can care a lot about, and this may not be one of them anymore. I don't know, but it may not be. What's your reaction to that?
I talk to a lot of audiences all over Ontario, and I am convinced, and I think at the end of my talk, my audience is convinced that climate change is the single largest threat facing all of us. we can no longer have both the climate that we depend on and the economy that we're used to. In fact, we may not be able to have either. On the other hand, there are tremendous opportunities as we are going to be forced to adjust, but as we adjust, we can build things that are better. We don't have to have a world in which the average person spends so many hours every week commuting. That doesn't make people's lives better. We have a lot of opportunities to build a world that is more pleasant to live in, gives our kids a decent future, gives us better lives. So, you know, one of the jokes I always made with people is look at energy efficiency. Because we are some of the most wasteful people in the world, we've got a lot of opportunity to get better and still have great lives. And actually, once people see something that they can do that's constructive and that they can do with their friends and neighbors and colleagues, a lot of people are energized.
Gotcha. That's the Environmental Commissioner for the Province of Ontario, Diane Saxe. Hope you'll come back and visit us again sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.